Hi, I'm Dr. Mindy Patterson. I'm the founder and CEO of Renutrin Dietary Products. As a nutrition expert and fiber researcher for over 10 years, I wanted to take this opportunity to translate not only my research findings, but other research findings to consumer products that would empower individuals to take ownership of their own health. You may know or you may not, but almost 50% of the US adult population is afflicted with either prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. These unhealthy blood glucose levels over time can lead to a myriad of other problems, such as cardiovascular disease, inflammation of the blood vessels. It can also cause permanent and often irreversible damage to the retina and the kidneys. So really important to keep those blood glucose levels, whether it's fasting blood glucose or postprandial, meaning after you eat, under tight control. So today I really want to highlight my research and just sort of give an overview of a particular fiber called resistant starch. This is a prebiotic fiber, and you may or may not have heard of it, but today, hopefully, after the end of this session, you will definitely have a better understanding of what resistant starch is, how it works, sort of an overview of how it works, and where we can find it. Okay, but before we define resistant starch, I need to provide background on starch. So where do we find starch? Well, they're actually a carbohydrate found in starchy foods, such as breads, grains, cereals, beans and legumes, rice, pasta, potatoes. So those are just a few examples of starch is only made up of glucose. So if you think about what a monosaccharide is, so monosaccharides are the simplest form of carbohydrate, and there are three of them: glucose, galactose, and fructose. So these are monomers, meaning unit of one. So glucose is one unit of carbohydrate, I guess you could say. So these starch granules, essentially, because the starch is actually housed in granules in the food, is solely made up of glucose, 100% glucose. In fact, it's called a homopolysaccharide, meaning homo meaning one type, poly meaning many, so many glucose monomers, and saccharide meaning carbohydrate. So starch, I need to sort of explain the makeup of starch. Now, we know it's 100% glucose, but how that glucose is interlaid inside of that starch granule. So the glucose can be either linked in linear form, or they can be in branches. The linear form, or the linear linkages, that means it's going to just form a straight line, basically. That is called amylose. And this is going to be important later when I talk about resistant starches. So amylose is that linear linkage of glucose monomers. And then when we have branches, so we might have glucose that sort of pivot and make a little branch, and that's called amylopectin. So you can imagine those starches that have a higher amount of amylose would have more linear glucose monomers, so many lines, and that could potentially compact together. Those starch granules that have a higher amylopectin concentration are not going to be able to pack as tight as those with more amylose. Typically, our starchy foods are going to have anywhere between 20 to 30% of amylose, and the rest is going to be amylopectin. So really not a lot of linear glucose molecules within that starch granule. Now, I do need to talk about the digestibility of starch. So we talked about how it's only made of glucose. It has both amylose and amylopectin, They're large, and the starch granule is what is found inside of the starchy foods. When we cook these starchy foods, so let me give you an example. If you're cooking a potato, when you cook these starchy foods, that starch granule is subject to both heat and water, or some form of liquid. And that allows for the starch granule to sort of open up and form a gel. This gelatinization allows for our digestive enzymes to enter the starch granule and break it down. So when our enzymes are breaking down starch, it's releasing glucose, one monomer at a time. And that glucose gets primarily absorbed, and that's what causes the rise in blood glucose concentrations. Now, as a dietitian, and with all of my years as a nutrition scientist, you do not need to avoid carbohydrates. You do not need to avoid starches, okay? So what the purpose of this video is to highlight resistant starches and how they could potentially help not only your gut health, but your blood glucose concentrations. So really the picture is about not reducing starches. Of course, we want to eat optimal amounts of starches and carbohydrates in our diet. And a lot of the starchy foods like beans and legumes and cereals and whole grains, they also have fiber and other really important phytonutrients that are going to be beneficial for your overall health. So we don't want to exclude them in our diet. But I will, however, talk about how increasing the amount of resistant starch can be potentially helpful. Hey, we can actually classify starches based on how quickly they are digested in our small intestine. If the starch is fully digested within 20 minutes after eating, then it is called a rapidly digestible starch. If the starch is completely digested by our enzymes, and this happens in the small intestine, by the way. As a matter of fact, about 95% of nutrients that we ingest are going to be digested in the small intestine. So the majority of digestion and absorption occurs there. If the starch is fully digested between 20 minutes and 2 hours after we eat it, then that's known as a moderate or slowly digestible starch. And then that leads me to the starch that is not digested within 2 hours, and that is called resistant starch. Resistant starch is exactly what its name is, or name implies. It resists digestion in the small intestine. And because of that, resistant starch goes into the large intestine, where it has a plethora of events that happen, metabolism and metabolites are produced that can be beneficial to your health, in which I will describe a little bit later. So as I mentioned, resistant starch is not digested, so it does not release glucose in the small intestine for absorption, and it remains intact and enters the large intestine. Now, there actually are 5 types of resistant starch. Type 1 is a physically inaccessible starch that is resistant to digestive enzymes. So an example I'm going to give you, maybe like nuts and seeds, where there might be like a hull or some type of a kernel that is surrounding the starch, so the enzymes just cannot penetrate. Type 2 is when the enzymes cannot access the starch because the shape of the starch granule is not recognizable to our digestive enzymes. So such examples would be like raw potatoes or green bananas or just ripe bananas. Those are a couple of examples of type 2 resistant starch. Type 3 is going to form when we cook the starchy food. So that opens up the starch granule. It becomes gelatinized. And then we take that cooked food and we chill it. And that allows for the starch granule that was gelled to become compact again. And that process is called retrogradation. So these happen when we cook a food that contains starch and then we chill it, so it increases the amount of resistant starch during the chilling process. Okay, so an example would be potato salad. You're going to cook that potato salad using water or broth or whatever and heat, and then you're going to take those potatoes and you're going to chill it. And then you're going to add the ingredients to make your potato salad and you're going to eat it cool. Same thing with stir fry rice. When we stir fry rice, if we're going to do it the traditional way, we cook the rice, we chill the rice, and then we fry the rice. So that chilling process increases the amount of resistant starch in that food based on retrogradation. Type 4 is a chemically modified type of starch. And so it modifies the starch chemically in a way that the enzymes cannot access the glucose. Type 5 is when the starch granule forms a lipid complex, and that complex does not allow for our digestive enzymes to enter the starch granule. So what happens to the resistant starch when it is not digested and then it enters our large intestine? Well, it's actually a heyday for our gut microbiome. The gut microbes that are living inside of our large intestine, some certain taxa species, strains, are able to ferment or break down that resistant starch. So you can think of it as providing fuel for certain species of our gut microbes. And this process of fermentation allows for specific metabolites to be released. And these metabolites, mostly in the form of short-chain fatty acids, which the most common 3 short-chain fatty acids are acetate, propionate, and butyrate. Each of them have their own effects. So the first effect of the short-chain fatty acids is it can actually, mostly butyrate, can serve as a food source for the cells that line our intestine. You know, the cells that line our intestine, also known as enterocytes, are really important for maintaining the integrity of our gut lining. And this is crucial for our overall health. But those enterocytes need fuel. They need to make ATP so they can actually function and do what they're supposed to do, which is basically absorb nutrients. And so butyrate is the primary fuel for the enterocytes, allowing them to proliferate and reproduce appropriately. There's also some of the short-chain fatty acids and metabolites that can serve as food for other gut microbes. So an example of this is bifidobacteria can actually ferment resistant starch, resistant potato starch, and the increase in bifidobacteria allows for the proliferation and increase in Akkermansia. And Akkermansia is a really important gut microbe that allows for mucus lining of our small intestine to stay intact. That's another really key component of overall health. So really, we're using resistant starch to increase the number of, so what we're doing is we're increasing a bacteria, a beneficial bacteria, through the products that were released via fermentation of resistant starch from another type of bacteria. So this is sort of a symbiotic type of relationship with among the microbes within our intestine. Another role that these metabolites or short-chain fatty acids play is they can bind to certain receptors, G protein receptors, on the enterocytes and release these hormones called incretins. Now, you probably have heard of a very familiar incretin known as GLP-1 or glucagon-like protein 1. And glucagon-like protein 1, as well as another one called GIP, both of these incretins allow for insulin to be released from the pancreas and blood glucose levels to go down. So they're really important in maintaining blood glucose levels, appropriate levels of blood glucose, by getting the excess glucose out of the blood and into the cells as fast as possible. Now, GLP-1, which is the target of some of these designer drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy, they all act as agonists for GLP-1 receptors. That means they bind to the receptor that GLP-1 binds to, and that binding allows for the body to sort of say, oh, you have a lot of GLP-1, and so that's going to allow for better glucose control. It's going to allow for me to be satiated faster, or when I'm eating food, to promote satiety or food intake cessation. It's also going to allow the digestive system to slow down through the gut-brain axis, and this acts on the ileal brake. So basically, it's a sort of a signal that tells the gut to sort of slow down digestion. So if we slow the digestive process, that attenuates the nutrient assimilation, and therefore we have slower release of nutrients into the bloodstream, and that would include glucose. So incretins are very important, and we still have a lot to learn about them, but we know a lot about them so far. Because of resistant starch's actions on other gut microbes, it has been classified as a prebiotic. So a prebiotic is a type of fiber that selectively stimulates the growth, activity, and or function of certain beneficial microbes. And these beneficial microbes provide some type of health promoting action to the host. So we really want, we don't know what a healthy microbiome looks like. We don't know, oh, we need to have these species or these taxa and this amount. We don't know. We're not that far yet into the gut microbe research. But we do know that there are certain species and strains that we want more of than others. I gave the example of bifidobacteria and Akkermansia, and those two have been shown, specific strains, to benefit the host. So resistant starch is a prebiotic, and what's really great about resistant starch is it's not fermented rapidly. So you might have heard of other prebiotics like inulin or fructooligosaccharides. These are very rapidly fermented prebiotic fibers. And that rapid fermentation or breakdown causes the release of gas quickly. And that can lead to bloating, GI discomfort, some cases maybe diarrhea, so GI distress, and we don't want that. So resistant starch is very well tolerated, especially when compared to inulin, FOS, and chicory root, which is a form of inulin. Okay, so potato-resistant starch type 2 has been shown to increase bifidobacteria, Akkermansia, while other resistant starches like high amylose maize resistant starch type 2 has been shown to increase the abundance of ruminococcus. So what I want to highlight with those statements is that each resistant starch and where it's coming from, the food source, may act differently in the gut microbiome. So they all may have different functions. But you have to understand that the resistant potato starch study was done in healthy humans. And some of the ruminococcus studies have been done in individuals with certain chronic diseases. So you're going to have different microbiome profiles according to health state, disease state. Actually, everything impacts the gut microbiome. Diet is the number one influencer. So we have discussed some of the food sources of resistant starch and even how to increase the amount of resistant starch by cooking and chilling starchy foods. But we know that some food manufacturing companies have formulated resistant starch from potatoes, rice, wheat, barley, corn. And these products, they kind of look like cornstarch in a sense. That's the texture and the feel. They don't have any flavor. And they really don't have a lot of texture. Some are a little bit more gritty than others, but usually they're mostly well tolerated and people don't even know that they're ingesting them, even if you put it in water. So these are also known as functional fibers or functional ingredients. Many of these products can be purchased commercially, but some of them can only be purchased by the food manufacturing companies themselves. And so they use these resistant starches to replace digestible starches, such as white flour, as a way to not only increase the resistant starch content of the food, but also to reduce the amount of available glucose, because you're replacing some of that white flour with the resistant starch, and it also increases the amount of fiber in that product. You may be asking, how much resistant starch should I get each day? Well, clinical studies, which have been going on early 1980s up until today, show that about 10, 15, upwards to 30 grams of resistant starch should be consumed each day to confer a health benefit. However, some studies are now coming out showing that we can get benefits with much lower amounts, such as about 3.5 grams per day, can beneficially impact our gut microbiome. Now, are we consuming enough resistant starch in the US diet? Well, my group actually published a study in the Journal of Nutrition a couple of years ago where we looked at over 5,000 US adult diets. And we looked at the foods that they were consuming and we quantified the amount of resistant starch in those foods. And we found that on average, US adults consume about 2 calories per 1,000 calories per day. So if you're consuming a 2,000 calorie diet, you're eating about 4 grams of resistant starch on average. Now, obviously, if you want to increase the amount of resistant starch you're consuming, you should increase the amount of beans and legumes, the amount of chilled potatoes, chilled rice, chilled pasta. So those dishes will all increase the amount of resistant starch and dietary fiber in your diet. You can also find resistant starch in some supplements. So in summary, resistant starch is a prebiotic fiber. It's not digested in the small intestine. It is fermented by certain gut microbes and is known as a beneficial prebiotic. So it's basically upregulating the function and the quality and the abundance of the beneficial bacteria that will provide health properties to the host, which is us. Now, future videos will highlight certain studies about resistant starch and when they are used in an intervention and what some of the findings are. And I would like to delve into the specific mechanisms associated with resistant starch, which can be a little bit technical, a little bit biochemical, but I think in an effort to educate the public on how resistant starch, prebiotic fibers can all play a role in empowering their own health, it's really important to sometimes get into the details, into the weeds, so you can have a better understanding. I'm Dr. Mindy Patterson, the CEO and founder of Renutrin, dietary products that empower individuals to take control of their own health, specifically their blood glucose and their gut health. Thank you and take care.